All right, good morning. This is Tuesday's lecture, since I will be at this particular juncture actually lecturing also in Spain, 6 hours difference. What we're going to do today is we're going to do the foundation of a two-parter. We're going to discuss in some detail the concept of learning, and then when we meet on Thursday, we will discuss the concept of remembering. Today's lecture is really not as much as brain and behavior as one would like it, but I am going to try and make some distinctions by giving you what I think is might be called classical learning, and then I'm going to go ahead and go into the application of that classical learning to the business of how it relates to the brain. Thursday's lecture, which will come right after this one, will be focused on the aspect of remembering, the flip side. Somehow or the other, in the way we view psychology, we kind of convolute these, and I want to sort of dissect them in a ways that they're much more amenable to discussion. So with that in mind, let me begin by starting what could be considered to be the first step in any learning process, and that's the business of attention. For starters, we want to make sure that the organism is in a position to be, as we've discussed before, aroused sufficiently so that attention occurs. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again today, that we happen to be diurnal animals. Humans tend to be, unlike, for example, rats and roaches, who are nocturnal animals, and that's because we've been wired to have our reticular formation be activated during daylight hours, largely because in the midbrain area there are a couple of different nuclei that basically activate when light comes on and deactivates when light goes off. And that's what turns on the reticular formation and encourages the option for attention to occur. The work of Posner and others provide a good starting point to discuss how attention occurs, and maybe even the work of William James, who is the father of American psychology, is probably worth discussing as well. So, in essence, you have all kinds of possibilities. What Carl Rogers suggested was the phenomenological options. In other words, you can decide to do whatever you want, even though some of us are less able to control our attention. We can direct the attention in one particular way versus another. This sort of attention capacity requires the choosing of an option. So in the case of William James, for example, you have all kinds of opportunities to consider. However, you choose one or several, and that in turn decides what is it that you are. In fact, both William James and more recently even Carl Rogers suggested that what you choose to think about is what turns out to be who you are. One of our previous faculty members, a guy named Dr. Loren, actually did an analysis of what is it that you think, what students think during class. Can you imagine what students thought during class, Nicole? No? Well, imagine. Just let your mind focus. And it turns out then you would argue, at least William James would argue, that if that's what you focus on, that must be what you are. And I think as a student, you really should be focusing primarily on one particular area, in this particular case, brain and behavior. Hi, how are you? Hey, Sam. So, welcome. That's okay. Good. So we've been focusing on attention. So how is it that one can decide what is it that they're going to be is what they end up choosing to focus on. However, one part of the brain gets you going, specifically the frontal lobe, prefrontal lobe, gets you going to like, I'm going to focus on this. And another part keeps you, sustains that attention. So one engages the attention and the other one then sustains it. And the part that's interesting as well is that it should be streamlined and fluid. There should be no movement from focusing to sustaining that focus. The flip side is turning it off, or for that matter, having it turned off. Some of us in the class, I think maybe even myself, experience what we might call attention deficit disorder. One thing that's fascinating about ADHD, or attention disorder with or without hyperactivity, is that by design, a disorder should occur in 2% of the population. It turns out that maybe about a third of all boys in school have ADHD. And when you have a third of an entire classroom experiencing a disorder, it's not a disorder, it's more like a social situation. And I think it's fascinating that a large percentage of our boys have this particular problem. I don't necessarily understand that, and it's, to be frank with you, somewhat confusing. But leave it as it may, the idea is that you got to keep it going, and you want to make sure that you don't let it go if it's appropriate. Now, the flip side of if you will, driven to distraction, is the idea that you can theoretically change it when it's appropriate. So theoretically, good attention or fruitful attention is when you have finished a particular task that you're involved in, and when that task is finished, then the brain will let it release. We call that shifting sets. In other words, you have a particular focus. I'm going to study just or focus on only brain and behavior, and I'm going to sustain that for a short period of time, hopefully in this case at roughly an hour, and then when you finish sustaining it, you let it go and then move on. The problem becomes when you let it go inappropriately. In other words, halfway through this lecture on the 3 parts of attention, you've got distracted thinking about what is it that I should be thinking about since I'm a college student, and then you start thinking about how can I make that a reality on Friday, and then all of a sudden you've lost all the lecture notes, and then you're probably going to do well on Friday night, but not on November 13th, which is our next exam. The other side of all this is what we might call disinhibition, and that is the ability to sustain attention to the right things and not to be distracted to things that you should not be distracted. So, for example, saying a dirty joke might be perfect at a party with maybe same-sex people or maybe your friends, but saying a dirty joke to, say, for example, a preacher or a priest may not be a good idea, despite the fact that it's a good joke. In other words, you got to figure out when you got to have the attention and when you got to make sure you control it, if you will. And very often with people that have a brain injury, we'll talk about it later in the semester, traumatic brain injury, especially frontal lobe injury, including blast injuries in war, they have what we call disinhibition. They just can't get the right attention to the right things. And very often things sort of surface from the bottom, to put it simply, from your limbic system, that you shouldn't be letting go. The idea is that your limbic system should be reserved for, I don't know, Friday night maybe, unless you're if you're Orthodox Jew, you may want to leave that for Saturday night, because they obviously have a different areas of focus on Friday night. So in essence, if you don't do the right thing, then theoretically you could get disinhibited. And since Sam is here, Sam, do you know what happens when you drink alcohol? Are you 21, Sam?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, imagine you were 21 and you drank alcohol. What would happen?
You just don't, like, you know what you're doing, but you can't control what you're doing.
Or maybe you don't know what you're doing.
Okay.
Either way, but you become disinhibited.
Mm-hmm.
Your ability to check the attention, to inhibit, becomes problematic. And this is something that we have talked about already, and that is Thursday. We have talked about homeostasis, and that is you want to maintain a good place, so to speak, and these people don't necessarily have the capacity. Before I go any further and talk about the actual process of acquisition of information, because the first step, as I've said already, is you got to focus. If you don't focus, you can't acquire. So the first step is attention. But do you all know somebody that has ADHD, or for that matter, disinhibition? Either of you, well, the three of us here. Which one do they have?
ADHD.
And what happens?
It's my little brother. He does bad in school because he can't focus on the class or homework and
What's he focusing on instead?
playing outside or that pencil eraser or shoelace.
Okay, very good. So in essence, he can get attention, but he can't sustain it. Now, here's a fascinating thing. Kids have ADD or ADHD, or variations of the theme. I always find it fascinating that they can focus insanely on video games. Now, how is it that they can sustain the attention for 60 minutes on something that is so irrelevant, and then when they go in the classroom, they can't figure it out and sustain the attention? How about inhibition? Do you know anybody that has a problem? You all have a grandpa or somebody like that that says dirty jokes at Thanksgiving? No, do you have any of those?
Not anymore, but I've seen it.
Yes, and what happens?
I would say something is said, and then most people just kind of like,
Whoa.
we're just going to pretend that we didn't hear that and keep
Right.
going.
I had a relative that was racist, and we would go to a place that had a lot of, say, for example, black people or brown people or Asian people. He would just say, you know, a dirty word out loud, say, there's too many of those people in here, let's get out. And it's like, don't you realize that you just made a social mistake? No, that's the problem. That's why we call it disinhibition. Now, again, in the right social circle, maybe you can get away with it. The right time, the right place, even though it may be wrong. But the wrong place, the wrong time, we call it disinhibition. So attention is the first step in acquiring information. If you don't have it, if you can't sustain it, if you can't let go of it, it's a real problem. So we're talking about attention as being the first step and having 3 steps in the process of it. It's fascinating to me that some of us, like you guys, are in a position to be able to flow easily from one area to the other, and some of us just can't seem to handle that. But look for that disinhibition next Friday night when your friends are drinking and they're saying stupid things, and you're wondering why are they doing that. The frontal lobe is literally disengaged and not in a position to inhibit. And that's one of the most important things that the frontal lobe does. It focuses you, but also stops you. So be careful as you move forward. All right, so first step is attention. What do you think might be the second step in gathering information?
Processing is
Well, how about if we sort of understand it.
Yeah.
Okay? So the idea is I have to figure out what the heck's going on here. Because if I don't understand it, and I'm not sure I can store it and then subsequently retrieve it. So we're going to go into this next phase, which we're going to call understanding, and maybe if you prefer, the acquisition of data. To acquire data, I'm going to make life very simple. And that is, I'm going to share with you that there are really 3 ways to gather information that has been studied, maybe 4 ways, but certainly 3, if not 2, that we all seem to agree. And I'm going to go into some detail about that. And in fact, I think you guys have heard about this, but I'm going to try and put it in a context not only about learning or acquiring, but in addition, learning and acquiring as the brain modulates it. So let's go down to the path of the 2, maybe 3, possibly 4 basic approaches to acquiring information. And let's talk about one that hopefully, I don't know, rings a bell, and that is classical conditioning. And you're supposed to, at this particular juncture, you're supposed to say, wow, that was like an amazingly fast joke. What was a joke about that? It doesn't ring a bell?
The bell in the
Oh, yes. You need to understand that if you don't laugh at my jokes, that the test will be harder next time. That is not a joke. Okay, that's just a fact. Okay. All right, so that's classical conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning. You've heard about it like 100 times, hopefully. Can you tell me what that is? Because I think I've forgotten. Another bad joke. Okay. Okay. What's classical conditioning? What's the name associated with classical conditioning? Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov. All right. So let's talk about Pavlov. He was actually a physician who worked at the University of St. Petersburg. And having visited his laboratory, I can tell you that he didn't use the word psychology and he didn't use the word learning. And it turns out, for what it's worth, if you look at his book, Conditioned Reflex is the whole idea of learning as you and I think about it, and classical conditioning doesn't really apply. As a matter of fact, if you look at the book, or having talked to one of his intellectual grandchildren when I was first in St. Petersburg, 1992, I discovered that classical conditioning was not a word or a phrase that they used in Pavlov's lab. So it was like, what the hell? Are you kidding me? Because everybody in the U.S. hears about classical conditioning. Let's tell you what we have heard about it, and then let's tell you what they say it is, because it's an entirely different thing. At least an entirely different direction it's intended to be. In the U.S., we kind of think of behavior as sort of disconnected from the brain, and classical conditioning is also disconnected from the brain. And there are really 2 parts to classical conditioning, very simply put. We have, on one hand, we have a stimulus and a response. Sometimes people call this the SR theory, stimulus response. So red light, what do you do when it's red light?
You stop.
Okay, I usually go faster. No? You're not supposed to do that?
Okay.
No, that's a yellow. That's a yellow light. Yeah. Okay, I always get those colors mixed. So you have a stimulus, red, a response, stop. Okay? It's very simple, not very complicated. Now let's go a little further down that path. There's actually 2 kinds of stimuli and 2 kinds of responses. What are they, Sam? Biological and non-biological. You remember that? Basically, if we call it biological, like food, that's unconditioned. And if it's psychological, it's kind of like conditioned. You know, we've talked a little bit about motivation already, and there's 2 kinds of motivations. And it could be biological or it could be psychological. So, for example, when I say boy, you know, I'm hungry. I really wouldn't mind having some Domino's pizza. Thick? Do you like thick? Cheese, a lot of cheese? You know? Do you like anything else, like mushroom? Maybe? Yeah. How are your taste buds doing? A little hot.
I'm just ready for some pizza.
Yeah, you're ready for some pizza. That's psychological. The pizza itself is unconditioned and it's biological. So you have two kinds of stimuli and two kinds of responses. You have biological and you have psychological. The biological we call unconditioned. The psychological we call conditioned. Now, let's take this as an example. We have Colby who's going to be showing these videos in class. So Colby has a boyfriend. What's your boyfriend's name?
Andrew.
Andrew. Okay, so Andrew decides he's going to kiss Colby.
Yay!
And then in the process he says something like, oh baby, 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 you know, something like that. And then her heart goes like really fast. Okay, the unconditioned stimulus in this case is Andrew's kiss. The unconditioned response is Colby's response to that kiss. You know, I assume she kisses back. Okay, now he says in the process when he stops kissing something like, oh baby, baby, baby. Okay, so now that is the conditioned part of it. So he kisses her and says the word baby. All right, and Colby kisses back. Now, Andrew actually is leaving for a few months and he may not be able to talk to her for really a period of time and may not see her for a period of time. So now Andrew wants to make sure that he kind of makes Colby feel wanted and loved. So he's going to call once in a while and he's going to say on the phone, baby, baby, baby. And what happens, Sam?
She's gonna want to kiss.
He's going to want a kiss, or she's going to be thinking about a kiss. Now, the unconditioned response, or let's say he kisses her, the unconditioned response may be like 100 beats a minute. So the heart goes really fast. When he says baby alone, it may only be like 90. But it sure is a lot better than just hanging around, you know, and going to class, you know, where it's 72, you know. So what we do is we pair the unconditioned with the conditioned stimulus, the baby with the kiss, and you get a response. Then we have the only condition, that is the stimulus, and then we get a conditioned response. The conditioned response is less than that. Now, imagine that Andrew never returns to Wilmington. How many months of baby, baby on the telephone does it need to occur before baby, baby doesn't produce any heart rate? What do you think?
2 or 3.
2 or 3, 5, 10, 2, 3 years. If he's calling for 3 years and says baby, baby, and he doesn't see him, then what's going to happen is that you can have extinction. The brain is going to say, forget it. Okay? So, in essence, and here's the part that you don't know because this is really the part that Pavlov wrote about and what they think about in his laboratory. It's not about the conditioned and unconditioned, even though that's what you and I call classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning, which, by the way, is not found at all in his book, nor, for that matter, is found in his laboratory in St. Petersburg, or in those days, Leningrad. But what is found is the question that Pavlov had nothing to do with the stomach, even though he won his Nobel in 1904 for his work on salivation. What's really important is how does the brain figure out a concept so it becomes efficient in engaging in that activity. So in other words, imagine that let's change kisses to M&Ms. Every time that Andrew wants to be nice to Colby, he gives her an M&M.
Yay!
Well, if we did that all the time, what would happen to Colby? She would just blimp out, okay? And really, it should be just a thought of M&M or a thought of Andrew that should be enough. That's efficiency of learning. You shouldn't have to kiss someone all the time. If you see your boyfriend, he comes down from New Hampshire, he kisses you, he goes back to New Hampshire. You gotta just kind of live with the fact that he's not always available. And what we want is the brain to remember your boyfriend or your significant other in a way that you don't have to have them present to feel good about your boyfriend. And the brain becomes more adaptive. And in essence, the way Pavlov suggested that learning, what learning is a way to economize biological information or stimuli with psychological one so you can get the same results. And the way that the brain restructures itself is what he was really interested in. I was surprised because, like you, I've always thought of Pavlov as a learning theorist, as a behaviorist, as someone that was into stimulus and response, when in reality it was the connection between the stimulus and the response, and more importantly, the connection between the biological and the psychological stimuli, and to a degree the response, that was much more important to Pavlov. And specifically, what was going on in the brain so that could actually occur. Because imagine this scenario. If every time you were faced with a novel situation, you had to learn it, you would go nowhere. So learning is efficiency of goal-seeking behavior. And specifically, the brain is the mechanism that makes that possible, makes that likely. And for some of us, we're not very good at it, or alternatively, we were, and the disease process, like a brain injury, occurred, which now prevents me from making those connections as well as I should. Although I should tell you, all things being equal, you don't have to have much of a brain to learn a very simple conditioned reflex. In the case of the classical case of Pavlov, he actually used dogs and salivation as a way to make that happen. So it's not that hard to do. And even with a significantly brain injured person, you can get some basic, if you will, conditioning to occur. But that's one very, very, very simple and very important way to acquire information. And again, I want you to remember what I said. It's not about the stimulus and the response or the biological and non-biological. It's that essentially you're doing this pairing, what we call associated conditioning or classical conditioning. We're doing this pairing and then remembering that pairing so later on I can be efficient. I want to feel good even though I don't see Andrew. Because if I have to see Andrew all the time, I'm going to have my heart broken. So if I can only see him once in a while, that's just good enough. But remember, Sam, call your significant other regularly, but also make sure that you pair the biological with the non-biological. Otherwise, if you don't give them a firm handshake once in a while, what will happen, Sam?
They'll just forget and stop wanting it.
They forget. They forget. Okay? Now, before I go on, can you learn, like, bad pairings? Like, how about PTSD? Is in PTSD bad pairing when you pair loud sounds, for example, with fear? What the heck's going on? The brain itself, especially the hippocampus, just gets this nasty pairing. And you have a loud sound, and especially a fast, unexpected one, and that has been paired Sometimes all you need is once. Once. It was paired once at the wrong time, the wrong place, with the wrong outcome. And from that point on, every time you hear a loud blast, all you can think of is a bad thing. It's amazing. It's really easy to have the brain get fooled, and it's a pain in the ass to undo it. The easiest is for Andrew to disappear and never to come back with a biological stimulus. And then you have slowly but surely an extension. The brain says, this is a waste of time. Let's move on to something else. All right, so that's one big, simple way to acquire information. Do you guys know another one? This is what sometimes we refer to the Skinnerian approach, or operant conditioning. In this case, the guy who discovered it was a Harvard psychologist by the name of Edward Bradford Skinner, who was obtained his PhD from Harvard, then subsequently returned to Harvard, where he spent his career. He worked primarily, not exclusively, with pigeons, and his big thing was this business called operant conditioning. Now, in case you didn't pick it up, classical conditioning, or Pavlovian, which is not what they call it, is focuses on the antecedent, what comes before. This is what comes after. We're talking about learning that's influenced by the outcome rather than the stimulus. In case you didn't pick it up, stimulus learning is very, 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 very easy. And in fact, as I shared with you, sometimes all you need is one event to get that occurrence to just, if you will, associate. In the case of operant conditioning, the outcome of a behavior influences the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. So imagine that Andrew gives Colby a kiss. One could argue that this is good. Imagine that every time Andrew comes and he yells at Colby, that would be bad.
Mm-hmm.
There are two outcomes, in essence, to operant conditioning. One is reinforcement, which is roughly defined as anything you do to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. Anything that you do to increase the likelihood of behavior occurring in the future. The flip side of reinforcement is what we call punishment. Is anything you can do to decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring in the future. So you have two outcomes, if you will. One generally positive, you make it happen more. One generally negative. Now, having said that, going back to the M&Ms, or for that matter, kisses, I can't just have an M&M pop into my boyfriend's mouth every time I see him, because it just makes no sense. So how do you keep your boyfriend under wraps? Because I don't know if you know this, I have a feeling that there's more schizophrenia in men than in women, because women do this like a yo-yo thing with men. They just keep them kind of like, they throw them on the ground and then they come back up and they throw them down. How do you do that? How do you keep people in line? He's in New Hampshire. That's far away. How do you keep him like coming back for more? How does that work?
Positive reinforcement.
Well, you're doing positive reinforcement, but you're not seeing him all the time because he's so far away. So how do you make it happen? We have a girlfriend who has a boyfriend in Virginia Tech. You have a boyfriend in New Hampshire. You have a boyfriend in Chicago. What the heck's going on? How do you keep these guys coming back? How do you keep them coming back? I schedule a reinforcement. Yeah, that's right. Because, it's just, you got to economize. So there are two kinds. One has to do with the way you do it, and maybe some variation of the, well, how often. Okay, so one, it can be fixed, or the other one can be random. Fixes, Do you work?
Yeah,
Where do you work?
Starbucks.
Oh, that's right. I should know. And do they pay you every week?
Bi-weekly.
Okay, so every 2 weeks you get a paycheck. That's fixed. Okay? Any of y'all do waitressing work? You sometimes get tips and sometimes you don't get tips. What percentage, by the way, at Starbucks do people tip you?
It depends on the store. My store, it averages like $2.50 an hour on top of your rate. Other stores is like 60 cents.
Really? Okay.
Wow.
So there you go. So you never know.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't get it. So which one is harder to learn?
Random.
The random, the variable one. Like your boyfriend. If he was nice to you every Friday only, but sometimes he's good to you on Tuesday, sometimes on Friday, sometimes on Wednesday afternoon, keeps you guessing. Actually, it's the opposite. Women keep men guessing, so they don't really know what's going on. That's why they yo-yo. Sometimes they're nice to them, sometimes you're not. So we're always like at the lever, just pressing hard, hoping we get a pellet. Is this how it works, Sam? You don't know? I think so. I think that's how we keep each other under control, right? If we do variable, because you never know. You never know when you're going to be, your significant other's going to be nice to you. So you're always like cleaning the car.
It's a pop quiz.
Yeah. So what's that?
So it's like a pop quiz.
Yeah. Is that how you do with your significant other, Sam? No comment.
No.
Yeah, yes, because we're recording this. We could actually sell this to your significant other, and then they could find out how it is that you have complete control over them. All right, you don't really know what's coming, but also it's harder to forget, isn't it? When's your last boyfriend? They broke up with you in January, and here it is in October, and you can't get him out of the system. Why is that? Because you put them on a variable schedule. And they're still there, pressing, hoping like hell. Do y'all have any significant others that you broke up last year and they're still calling? You have that? Yeah.
Tumor.
What's that?
It's like a tumor.
It's a tumor. No, it's a variable schedule reinforcement. They're hoping that if they do 1,382 bar presses, the pellet will come out, right? So, yeah. Why do you do that, Sam? Why do you do that to people, Sam? Tell it. Are you just a bad person?
I'm not a bad person.
It's just how we do it. It's just how we do it. So variables, hard to learn and hard to forget. But there's also time or times. Time is like, let's go back to Starbucks. Do you get paid like Friday, every other Friday at 5 o'clock or something like that?
It's, I guess, like Thursday at midnight.
Thursday at midnight you get paid. But if you work as a waitress or waiter, you get, sometimes you get stiff, sometimes you get a good one, you never know. So that is times. The other one is just time. So you got variable, fixed, you have the passage of time or the number of events. Variable interval, fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable ratio. Okay. In terms of the brain, which one do you think is easier for someone who's autistic to learn? A fixed. Okay, make it easy. Every time or every so often and so forth. Every time is hands down the easiest way to learn in the brain. But here's the difficulty. If you teach me, because I have brain damage, that every time you walk in the room I should say hello, I could easily forget that just as fast. In other words, easiest to learn is easiest to forget. So if I can, let me go from fixed to variable, because that's a much more complicated wiring of the brain. That's the goal, okay? But that takes time. That's why we don't marry our significant others after a week worth of dating, because you got to train them, right? You got to get them. You got to get them right, and just doing a whole bunch of fixed intervals, like they smile and you pop in an M&M, or in this case, a Dunkin' Donuts thing. You know, all you're going to do is end up with a fat significant other. You don't want that. You want a lean, mean, and responsive significant other. You want to do the old yo-yo, okay? So it's basically training the brain. Now, as a rule, training the brain, it means engaging the frontal lobe. That's the part that kind of figures it out. But in case you forgot, get it? That's a tick. In case you forgot, then you got to store it. Okay, let's go to a contemporary thing. Did any of you guys watch the Kavanaugh hearings? Did anybody hear? I don't know if you remember that the person that was testifying was Dr. Ford, who happened to be a psychologist. She happened to be a neuropsychologist. I don't know if you captured what she said, but she said that she remembers that the laugh that occurred during the period of time that she was being assaulted. Everybody remember what she said? It's indelibly marked in my hippocampus. Okay? So it's the hippocampus that is like the storage of this kind of stuff. It may be the frontal lobe that's figuring out, are they laughing at me? And that laughing is, I'm interpreting as an embarrassment, ridiculing, a bullying. That's a frontal lobe thing. But it's a temporal lobe, the hippocampus, which is right next to the temporal lobe, and the upper gyrus, where all this stuff is condensed. So one figures it out, the other one stores it. They both work in unison. Without one, you don't have the other. I can figure it out, but if I don't store it, then it's no good. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next little while. So, in essence, this is how we do it. Now, have you heard of any other forms of learning? So, how about another one? I think you may have heard about it, but in case you haven't, let me share with you. That's social learning. You remember that? People like Albert Bandura and so forth. You remember that?
It's dolls,
Yeah. And essentially, what social learning is all about modeling, which, in case you didn't know, I always like to share personal things with you in class. This is how I make extra money. Why are you laughing? Why are you laughing, Sam?
No comment.
Okay. People are laughing. They're here today, and because they laughed at that commentary, which is really truth in action, they're going to get a very low grade on their next exam, because that's just not appropriate that they're laughing at the instructor, because I said it was modeling. But actually, so what's modeling? What's modeling?
I'm showing you the behavior I'd like you to perform.
Yeah, so I am actually showing you behavior now. You're thinking of modeling as like me going in the runway, you know, in high heels. Well, that would be interesting. But you get the drift? I do make money modeling. And it says I act a certain way and people might follow it. Now, do you think this is fast or easy? Does the brain get it very fast? No, social learning really is a very slow process. Unlike, for example, classical conditioning, where one trial could take care of business. Or in the case of, say, for example, punishment. Punishment can decrease behavior right away, but it turns out to be not very effective for long term. In social learning, it's good, but it takes a long time because you need a lot of exposure to a certain situation. So we now know, for example, that parents who were abused themselves are more likely to abuse their offspring. Now that's going to take a long time. And the flip side is going to take a long time to get rid of. So, and this is again the frontal lobe trying to figure out, how is it that I understand this? And imagine a situation where the person that's modeling for you is doing a really bad job of it. So, for example, I'm your father, and I'm drinking, and I'm cussing, and I'm smoking, and I'm a slob. That's not so good. Now, later on, how long do you think it might be before I can get rid of that? In other words, I've decided that all men are slobs. They're not couth. They're not nice. It's going to take a while for me to kind of undo that. Now, can I do it? Yeah. It's going to be fast? Nope. Not at all. So, today we've discussed with you basically two parts to this business of learning. The first part is I've got to focus. I've got to sustain it, and for that matter, I've got to let go of it, or in some cases, not. Then after that comes the three parts that I've shared with you of acquiring knowledge. And that is, how do I understand that knowledge? Well, I can do it through classical, operant, or social learning. And remember what I said, they're all critical because they involve different parts of the brain, and when in unified fashion that pattern occurs, significant acquisition of data could occur. And once that data does occur, in other words, once I get that data brought in, then now I'm in a position to do something with it. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit for a few moments about how do we store that data, and then how do we retrieve it. And I'm going to go more into detail on the memory part in our next lecture, but let me just add this third component. So now I've acquired this information, whatever the heck it is, through classical, opera, whatever. Let's do a third part. I've got to find some kind of file cabinet. I got to store that for later use. And sometimes I store it under, this is a good experience, a bad experience, stored under psychology, under math, whatever the case is. So I've got to figure out, now that I've got this new knowledge, what file cabinet in my brain do I store this information? Okay? And this is where we're going to go into some detail when we get together. So we've had roughly 50 minutes worth of lectures. I think that should do it for this section of today's lecture. And let's one more time emphasize what I started by at the beginning, and that is that we had a class Thursday, we have a class by online or in presence on Tuesday. We'll have another one this Thursday. We'll have two more lectures the following week on intelligence and consciousness. And finally, when we finish those, we'll have a help session, probably maybe that weekend, in anticipation of our exam, I believe is November 13th. So for now, thank you for listening, whether you've been online or you attended class, and we look forward to our next presentation on Thursday. See you soon. Bye-bye.